Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode. Today we will be doing a Q&A video where I answer some of your dog training questions. I'm going to be answering 10 dog training questions in each video. So if yours is not in this video, then it should be in one of the following videos in this series. Be sure to check the description where you can find your question and you could jump to that section in the video. So let's go ahead and get started. The first question is, my dog is afraid of going down our spiral staircase. How can we help her overcome this? She's a 9-month-old Malinois. Often dogs will go through what's known as a fear period between 7 to 9 months of age. This is where they're afraid of things that they may not have been afraid of before, or things that really there's no logic behind their fear, at least not to us humans, but to them it's very real. So we can help them overcome this by implementing what's known as counter conditioning or desensitization, where we take whatever it is that they're afraid of and we make it predict something pleasant. This is the most simplified way of explaining it. It's also very similar to confidence building. The main difference between counter conditioning and confidence building is with confidence building, you just expose your dog to new things and you make these things predict something pleasant, therefore creating a positive association. With counter conditioning, it's something the dog is afraid of and you're trying to change the way they feel about whatever it is by making it predict something nice. So with this specific situation, what I would do is I would turn mealtime into training time, meaning I would train my dog with my dog's meals. And if my dog is not willing to train, my dog doesn't eat. This will also increase the dog's food drive. So I would bring the dog out to the top of the spiral staircase. I would offer her some food. If she doesn't take it, no big deal. We try again at dinner time, making sure we do not give any food in between the training session. Bring her back out, bring her to the top of the staircase. I'm not going to ask her to go down the staircase the very first time, just at the very top. I'll give her some rewards, get her comfortable there. Excellent, do some obedience. Now we were able to feed her a meal, and then we're going to do it again the next day. See if she's more comfortable. If she's more comfortable, I might ask her to try to place one paw rather, on the very first step. If she does that, I reward. Then we do some obedience again at the top of the stairs, not asking too much too soon. As she becomes more comfortable with that, I'd gradually start asking for more steps. As she successfully accomplishes each step, I would mark and reward. If I've been doing this for a while and the dog is still a little cautious of going down the stairs, then I could also teach the dog leash pressure, make the dog understand that they have to go with the pressure on the leash, and then I can use that to get my dog to go down the stairs as well. Maybe not the entire staircase at the very beginning, but a few steps, getting her comfortable, allowing her to go back up the stairs, and repeating this process until I'm able to get her to go down the entire staircase. This can take a long time depending on the dog, or it could happen in a few days. It really depends. You just want to make sure you're progressing at the pace in which she's learning and her confidence is going up based on successful reps. So I hope that helps. Let's go on to the next question. How do I start a 12-week-old puppy on scent detection? Okay, so what you're going to want to do with this is the imprinting stage for a dog, the first 16 weeks, and it's great that you're starting at this young age. What we want to do, we're not worried about making the puppy an expert at scent detection. That's not the goal. But what you do want to do is make the puppy love scent detection training. If you've seen my scent detection series, you could probably start with step 2, field search, or just creating a positive association with the odor by having that odor predict your puppy's favorite toy. What I would do is I would take the puppy's favorite toy and I would put it in an airtight container with the odor that we want to teach the puppy on the inside of the lid, not directly on the toy. You leave it in there overnight and there's going to be a strong enough of an odor on the toy. And then you're just going to play with your puppy with the toy. You can start doing field searches like I demonstrate in the second episode in the scent detection series, but just don't expect as much from a young puppy. Maybe toss it in front of them, maybe spin them a little bit and then send them to get the toy. So then they're going to go where they saw the toy last, and then they will naturally, instinctively use their nose to find the toy. And then that's going to be the main thing that I'm going to work on with the puppy, really creating that strong association to that odor by having that odor predict a toy. You can also start doing free shaping. Free shaping is going to be a big part of doing scent detection training, because with a scent dog, we want them to be willing to work in order to get access to a reward without having to always rely on the handler. And scent detection is helped great deal by doing free shaping. Free shaping is we don't have anything in mind we want the dog to do, but when they do something that we like, we mark and reward. It doesn't have to be something complicated, just anything that the puppy does that you like. Maybe the puppy lays down, the puppy sits, he looks at you, he spins, whatever. If he's doing something that you like, mark and reward without asking him to perform these behaviors. This creates that proactive dog, the dog that starts to seek out behaviors that predict rewards. And if you feel like going above and beyond, then you can do the first step that I have in the scent detection series, where you start having your dog jump up on the climb platform in order to get access to the reward. So again, that would be fix shaping. You have something in mind you want your puppy to do. You don't ask your puppy to do it. You wait till your puppy makes the right choice. Then you mark and reward. And you could even have your young pup sticking his or her nose into the container in order to get the reward as well, that I demonstrate in my scent detection video series. So to answer your question, make it as fun as possible, make your puppy love the scent detection training, build your pup's confidence, and do some of that free shaping that will help create that proactive dog. All right, next question. How do you get a puppy to not bark constantly while playing? This one's a little bit more difficult to work with. The reason why is if your puppy is barking out of play, that's very similar to my dog, Ari. She barks all the time for play, excitement. She barks, she loves to do it. And I made the mistake of rewarding that behavior when she was a puppy. And because of that, I'm not going to try to correct it, because if I try to stop it while she's playing, she may associate it with playing and then become uncomfortable or not know when it's okay to play. And if this is the case, usually my recommendation is to let the puppy or let the dog bark while playing. If you really do want to stop it, then one of the things you can do is start playing with your dog or your puppy. The moment the dog starts to bark, stop the play. Wait a minute, start playing again. Your dog barks, stop playing. You want to show your dog that barking is going to stop the game. It's not going to predict a correction or anything that's going to seem unpleasant. It's just going to stop the game. And then if your young pup is able to pick up on this, then hopefully the idea is that he will stop barking while playing, because he learned that barking stops the game. If he doesn't want the game to stop, he doesn't continue to do that behavior. So I hope that helps. Do you use corrections when training a dog? If so, at what point do you find it necessary to give a dog a correction? If you do corrections correctly, you can create a very reliably trained dog in any environment. In fact, the only way you can get a dog to be at 100% reliability is by implementing positive punishment, a form of a correction to stop an undesired behavior or to get reliability within our obedience commands. We have two types of issues when dealing with a dog. We have behavioral issues and we have obedience issues. Now, if our dog is doing a behavioral issue and it's a self-rewarding or self-fulfilling behavioral issue, then that needs to either be stopped one of two ways: by preventing the dog from being able to practice the behavior, simply not allowing them to do it, or correcting them for doing the behavior. For example, let's talk about a dog that jumps up on people. If the dog is jumping up on people because the act of jumping up on people is something the dog enjoys, then the technique of simply turning your back and crossing your arms and ignoring the dog is not going to work in this situation. The reason is because the dog likes jumping, so the dog will continue to jump. Now, if the dog was only interested in the attention and being pet by the human, and if the dog jumped up, the human turned away and crossed their arms, now this is creating the exact opposite of what that dog's goal was. And if you wait for that dog to stop jumping up and then you start to pet him, then that dog will learn, oh, okay, if I want to receive attention and affection from this human, then I have to sit politely on the ground and they will provide that reward for me. Jumping up simply makes it go away. That's implementing negative punishment, removing something of value from the dog for doing a specific behavior. So those situations, we have to adjust accordingly to each dog. Now, if it's a behavioral issue, something such as digging or getting into the trash or chasing after cars, those I do correct right away. I use positive punishment to remove that from the dog's repertoire. Now, when we're correcting our dog, the correction has to be adequate to that dog's training level. An analogy I often talk about is a speeding ticket analogy. Let's say you're driving down the highway, police officer pulls you over and writes you a 25-cent speeding ticket. You're probably going to keep speeding. It's not enough to get you to slow down or to get you to change your behavior. But let's look at the other extreme end of the spectrum. This would be known as an avoidance level correction, a correction so high you never do the behavior ever again. That would be if the police officer pulled you over and wrote you a $100,000 speeding ticket. You're never going to want to drive again. It's not going to be worth it. You're going to be stressed out and you're going to avoid driving. Now let's say that he writes you a $200 speeding ticket. That's enough to get you to slow down without getting you to avoid the behavior of driving. Now that's the same when we're implementing any sort of positive punishment, a physical correction to our dogs. It has to be adequate to their bank account. Some dogs are very rich, some are very poor. If you're giving your dog a correction and that dog continues to practice the undesired behavior, then the correction is not high enough. Remember, everything our dogs do is based on motivation. They're either motivated to access something pleasant, or they're motivated to prevent something unpleasant, or the behavior itself is fun. If I give a dog a correction and they continue to do that behavior, that means the motivation to do the behavior is overriding the motivation to prevent the correction. Look at bank robberies, for example. Why do most people choose not to rob the bank? Because the motivation not to go to jail overrides the motivation to make a quick buck. Now, some people still rob the banks. Those people, their motivation to make the money overrides the motivation to prevent going to jail. So we have to look at each dog's individual motivating factors. If it's a normal behavioral issue, we can just correct it, and that will normally remove it from the dog's behaviors. However, if the behavior is based on fear, just like earlier, you cannot use a physical correction to stop that behavior. It's only going to make it worse. If you have a dog afraid of something and you correct them to try to get them over the fear, their fear becomes worse because you're solidifying that they should be afraid of whatever it is you're trying to correct. So if you're dealing with fear, counter-conditioning and desensitizing them is going to be your best friend when it comes to fixing those issues. But if it's not based on fear, let's say digging, the dog goes to dig, I have a leash and collar on the dog is digging. The moment they're digging, I say no, I pop the leash, giving them a correction. The moment they stop digging, yay, good puppy. When giving corrections, we have to make sure to never make the corrections personal, meaning we don't get angry, we don't yell, it's simple cause and effect. If you go to dig, I can't help it. I have to pop the leash, giving you a correction. And the moment you stop, I'm going to praise and reward you for making the correct decision. This is important. Again, we don't ever want to get mad. We don't want to yell at them. That could create fear, and that could create, or it could lower their confidence. And remember, we're always trying to build their confidence. We're working together with our dogs on the same team towards a common goal. Now let's talk about obedience. This is going to be different from our behavioral issues. If I'm correcting a dog for obedience, there's certain things that are required before they're given any sort of correction. And again, my corrections, if I am using them, I'm using a training collar with a leash or remote training collar. Depends on what I'm trying to accomplish. If I want a dog to be off leash trained, then remote training collar is going to be the only way to do that, to where we can have the dog 100% reliable. And 100% off leash reliable. So both my dogs, Charlie and Ari, are trained on a remote collar, and I use a remote collar every time I take them to a location where they're going to be off leash. I almost never have to correct them, but I want to have that control. So let's say I'm taking my dogs on a hike and they see a coyote and they decide they want to chase the coyote. I can stop them with the remote training collar. I like to call it my safety net. We don't want to fall into our safety net, but if we do fall, it's there to catch us. And that's why we use this. Again, for reliability and making sure our dogs are as safe as possible. Nobody gets a dog to correct them, but we correct them to make sure they're safe in the world in which they live with us humans. So now, in order to correct a dog for obedience, the process that I take is, number one, they have to know what command I'm asking them to perform. So we're going to talk about correcting for obedience commands. If I give a dog a command, let's say down, and the dog chooses not to do it, well, I have to make sure they know the command on the verbal alone. That means I tell the dog down, and the dog lays down every single time on the verbal command without being helped with the physical cue. The next step is the dog also has to know how to turn off pressure by complying. We do this by leash pressure training. Leash pressure work is one of the biggest things when it comes to training a dog clearly and effectively and not creating any issues. I'm laughing because Ari keeps looking up at the camera. She keeps walking back and forth. But leash pressure is huge, and I highly recommend, if you haven't watched my leash pressure training video, to check it out and start implementing leash pressure in your training. Now I have a dog, I tell the dog to down. If the dog goes into a different commanded position, let's say the sit, that's when I use the non-reinforcement marker, which is a signal for negative punishment, withholding a reward. So I have the treat, let's say you're the dog, I say down, you sit instead, I say wrong, down, you go down, yes, reward. So then I'm giving the dog a clear path to get the reward, and I'm not correcting them when they're making a mistake. We don't want to correct dogs for mistakes, because if we start correcting them for mistakes, they're not going to be as willing to try new things. For example, if you've seen my video on how to teach a dog to ring a bell, Ari, I never corrected her for making a mistake, so she's always willing to try new things in order to get access to the reward. So that's very important. Now I teach the dog how to turn off pressure by complying by using the leash pressure. So when I first start giving a dog a command, when they first start choosing not to listen to it, I reinforce it with the leash pressure. Now, if you're using a word that predicts leash pressure, then you want to use a different word that predicts a correction with the training collar. The reason for this is if you use the same word for both and the dog becomes conditioned to the word predicting a correction, when you're using it for leash pressure, the dog is still going to have all the same associations with whatever it is that you're doing that they would feel when you correct them. A dog trainer that I'm a huge fan of, Michael Ellis, I love the way he explains this in one of his videos. He says, if I walk up to you every day and I say, hey, and I punch you in your stomach, eventually I walk up to you, I go, hey, you go, huh, whether or not I hit you. The body takes over. So it's the same with our dogs. So we want to make sure we use a different word that predicts, one predicts leash pressure, the other one predicts a leash pop or a correction on the training collar. So I tell the dog to down. This would be the first step. The dog chooses not to down. I say wrong. That's my word for the leash pressure, let's say, or bad, or whatever we want to use. Then I apply the leash pressure, placing the dog into the commanded position. I release the pressure once they do it. Good job. So I'm going to first start doing that. So then if they make a mistake, they know what they have to do in order to fix that mistake. This is, again, very important. When we correct a dog, they have to know what they're being corrected for. They have to know how to turn off pressure by complying while we're giving them a very clear path to success. So now I've done all these steps. Let's say I tell the dog to sit. The dog looks at me and says, I don't want to sit. Within the first second of the dog choosing not to sit, I say one no. I pop the leash upward, giving the dog the direction that I want them to do the behavior. Up is for sit if we're doing leash pressure training, so they should understand that. After I give the correction, I recommand sit. Then I help the dog go into the commanded position with the leash pressure. I don't continue to correct for the same mistake over and over again. And when you first start adding corrections to a dog, it might get them a little flustered. They're not used to it, so they're not thinking as clearly. So we want to help them be successful. We wouldn't want to go sit, no correction. Sit, no correction. Sit, no correction. That would be very unfair. We do not want to do that. It would be sit, the dog doesn't sit, no correction, sit. We help the dog with leash pressure, good dog. That's going to help get you to a point where you have very reliable obedience without creating any sort of fear or additional stress with your dog. If, again, my dogs are trained on remote collars, it gives them absolute freedom. They can run around and do whatever it is that they want because I have control of the remote collar. So this information is also going to be written out in my training manual, version 3, when it's released. Should be here in a couple weeks, maybe a week or so, so be sure to check that out. I hope that answers your question, but that's the process basically that I like to follow when I'm implementing corrections in my dog training routine. All right, next question. How do you increase motivation and drive in a dog that's only moderately interested in food and toys? When it comes to increasing our dog's motivation, there are a few things that we can do. When a dog doesn't have a very high food drive, that's often caused by a few different things. One, it could be the dog is being free-fed. Sometimes just feeding a dog out of a bowl will lower the dog's food drive. Giving the dog very high value rewards, such as a cooked piece of steak, may lower your dog's food drive. When I'm raising a dog, especially during their imprinting stage, that first 16 weeks, I make them work for every bite of food, which greatly increases the value into adulthood. So then when I'm working with that dog as an adult, even if they just ate a full meal and they're comfortable, they're still going to want to work for the food because I did that during the imprinting stage by making them work for every bite of food. So simply by turning mealtime into training time, and what I mean by that is you use the dog's meal in order to train them. Now, sometimes depending on where you are in the training, if you're doing continual reinforcement still, rewarding every single behavior, then you can just use every single behavior as an opportunity to give your dog some of their food. If you're spacing out the rewards, so your dog's not getting a reward now after every single rep, then you could just give the dog larger handfuls when they do complete 10 correct behaviors or wherever it is that you are in your training. So you're still able to use mealtime as training time. That will increase the dog's food drive. And that's my number one recommendation. If you bring your dog out I talked about this a little earlier in the video. If you bring your dog out and you ask your dog to do a behavior for food and they say, I'm not interested, no problem. You stop training, you don't give the dog any food. When dinner time rolls around, you offer the dog another opportunity to train for the food. If the dog still says, nope, not interested, you say, no problem, we'll try again at breakfast. Breakfast rolls around, you offer the food to your dog while training. Your dog says, okay, now I'm hungry, I'm willing to work for the food. And that's going to increase the dog's food drive. I've done that with a lot of dogs that had very low food motivation, and I was able to increase their food motivation really fast by implementing that technique. Now, when it comes to toy drive, one of the best ways to increase our dog's toy drive is by using dry building exercises. You can see an example of this in my video on how to teach your dog to bark on command. You can do this one of two ways. You can have your dog with either a harness or an agitation collar on. An agitation collar is a very thick collar that distributes the pressure across their entire neck so they're able to pull, or you can use a harness designed to pull, and then you can have either somebody holding the leash like we're doing in the video, or you can have it attached to something. I like to have it attached a little bit higher off the ground because then the dog's pulling and they're not going to step on the leash. You could have it lower as well, but they might step on the leash while doing the dry building exercise. So a little higher is going to be better to prevent that. Then you tease them with the toy. You tease them, you act like, hey, this toy is the most amazing thing. Wouldn't it be fun if you could play with it? And when they get frustrated enough or they bark, then you reward them with the toy. So you're using frustration in order to increase the dog's toy drive. So usually that will work, and I'll do that once a day for a couple weeks to really build the dog's food drive. So check out the video, you can see how we do it there, and I'm going to be putting up more videos in the future specifically on dry building exercises. My 8-month-old golden retriever gets super excited when my sibling runs around. He will then jump up and grab onto their arm. He doesn't bite, he just holds on, but it's enough that it doesn't feel very good. How do I teach him to stop or at least let go when asked? This is going to go back to the leash pressure training that we talked about earlier. Leash pressure has so many different applications when it comes to clearly communicating with our dog, and it really should be called a leash cue because we're using it as a cue, again, for clear communication. The more clear we are to our dogs, the faster they learn. And this is what I would do in this situation. First, I'm going to teach the dog how to turn off pressure by complying, and that goes right with the leash pressure training. And I implement the word, whatever word we want to choose. Again, just be consistent with it. For this example, let's just stick with the word wrong. So I can use it for multiple things that I don't want the dog to do without adding a correction. So let's say the dog jumps up on the couch. I can go wrong. I can use the leash pressure, cue the dog off the couch, good dog. Name it, whatever it is. The dog gets into something you don't want, wrong, apply leash pressure, they stop, yay, good dog. So we're giving them an opportunity to learn what they're not supposed to do without giving them a correction. I also like to use this when I have a dog that's interacting with another dog or another human when they're doing something that I don't want. I never recommend implementing any form of positive punishment when a dog is actively engaged with another dog or another human. The reason why is because they could end up believing that it's the other dog or human that's causing the correction, at least when the correction comes from their neck. So if you're correcting your dog on a training collar around their neck, they could think it's the other person or the other human. So we don't want to do that because we don't want to create any sort of aggression towards people or dogs. So what I do rather in this situation is I use the leash pressure. I set the puppy up, puppy runs and bites whoever. And I say wrong, I apply the leash pressure. The moment the puppy stops biting, I turn the pressure off. Yay, good pup. And then we're able to continue going from there. Anytime the puppy does that behavior wrong, I use the leash pressure, preventing them from being able to practice it. And after enough reps, the pup says, there's no value in biting. All it does is it stops the play. It predicts leash pressure. So I'm not going to continue to practice this. And the behavior should quickly become a behavior of the past. All right, next question. My dog goes crazy with the mailman, but I feel like she's afraid but aggressively barking. What are the steps I could take to handle this? This is another question that goes back to our counter conditioning, and we have a situation where the dog is afraid of the mail person. What we want to do is, at least this is what I would do, is I would find out what time on average the mailman comes around. If I'm not able to do any training during this time, then I'm going to make sure my dog or my puppy simply can't see when the mailman comes by. I'm going to put the dog in the crate or the puppy in the crate, whatever, just to reduce the likelihood of the dog practicing this bad behavior that I don't want, which is going to be barking. Now, if I'm able to be in the situation when the mailman comes around, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to reward my dog and I'm going to do obedience. So I'm going to make sure I'm far enough away. So let's say up at the front window is where the dog is going to react the most to the mailman or the mail person coming around. Then I'm going to make sure I'm training my dog perhaps in the kitchen where my dog can see the front window and may be able to see the mailman, but is far enough away to where it's not going to create any sort of response or reaction from my dog. As my dog gets more comfortable training while the person comes by, so now I'm creating a positive association because I'm training, which your dog should enjoy if you're doing the training correctly, because it predicts play, it predicts engagement, and predicts rewards. So now we're creating that positive association by having the mail person coming around predict training. If your dog stops in the middle of the training and barks, then what you can do is you can back up a little farther to where there's not as much of an opportunity or there's not as much of the stimuli in order to create that reaction. So the farther you are away from the stimuli, the less likely your dog is going to be to react to it. And as your dog becomes better with this, you simply get closer and closer to where your dog would be in the position reacting in a way that you don't want, but no longer reacting because now the dog is more focused on obedience. So again, we take something that the dog may be afraid of and we change the way they feel by having it predict something pleasant. You just have to make sure anytime you're doing counter conditioning that you're not rewarding your dog when your dog is acting out the fearful or the undesired behavior. Because if you do that, if you're rewarding the dog while they're doing the behavior you don't like, then the dog's going to think that's a behavior you want and they're going to end up repeating it even more. So very important, make sure you don't reward while your dog's acting out the bad behavior. Another thing you can do is when your dog sees the mailman, get your dog's attention the moment your dog looks back at you, mark and reward. So then your dog's responsibility becomes, I see the mailman, I look at you, I get a treat. I see the mailman, I look at you, I get a treat. And then that's going to be their default behavior. So again, we change what it means by what it predicts. How to deal with reactivity towards other dogs on and off leash. My dog is a female, 1-year-old border collie, and she hates it when other dogs are on the leash or behind a fence, and she barks like crazy, pulls horribly, does flips in the air, and I get scared she'll get hurt. When we're at the park, she's very social with the dogs that are inside, but hates the ones that pass outside. When I take her on walks, she barks at dogs that are even inside their houses. The fact that your dog is comfortable with other dogs while she's in the park makes me believe that her reactivity does not have to do with fear, but rather more frustration. Just like where I was talking about building a dog's frustration in order to increase a dog's food drive by putting them on a back tie and using that frustration in order to get the dog to bark, our dogs may do the same thing on their own when they're on a leash or there's some sort of barrier. It could be that your dog wants to get to these other dogs and that frustration is coming out as barks. If you don't want your dog to bark while going on a walk, I've dealt with a lot of dogs that have this exact same issue, and often just implementing positive punishment is going to stop the dog from doing that behavior. So you take your dog on a walk. Again, if you're adding any sort of corrections in training, follow the steps that I talked about earlier in this video. But I would take the dog, I would be far enough away to where it's not going to create a strong reaction, but enough to where I can do a correction. This is going to keep it at a low enough of a level so where the correction doesn't have to be that high since the stimuli is not that high. When the dog goes to bark or whenever the dog is doing whatever I don't like, I can first start by implementing leash pressure. So I say my wrong, I lift up on the leash, the dog sits, I turn off the pressure, the dog stops barking, good dog. If the dog continues to act it out, the dog barks or gets frustrated at the other dog, no, correction. The moment the dog stops barking, yay, good dog, and we pet and reward them for doing the correct behavior. So again, the process is always going to be the same. First, we show them what we don't want them to do by using the leash pressure. That's going to be the best way in order to make sure the dog has a very clear path to success. And then if they continue to practice out the behavior, we can implement positive punishment. Make sure it's at your dog's correction level. Again, what we talked about earlier, you don't want it so high that your dog avoids the behavior entirely, meaning if you corrected her too high when she was out and about on a walk, she may not want to go on a walk anymore. So again, we want to make sure the correction is adequate to her bank account. And we also don't want the correction to be so low that she continues to do the behavior that we don't want. However, when it does come to correcting, I always prefer to start on the lower end and increase if necessary. I hope this answers your question. How to stop resource guarding with me and my family. My dog doesn't like other dogs to even get near us, let alone try to be pet by us. She gets very aggressive and only leaves the dog alone once they back off of us. Mind you, she isn't like this with anything else, not food or toys, nothing, just the family. This is another common problem that a lot of people run into. The dog is resource guarding the humans, is what's happening. And this is one of the few occasions where a dog is doing a form of resource guarding and we can correct them for it. I usually don't recommend correcting a dog that is resource guarding food or toys, as it could often make the aggression worse. There are different steps that we can do to fix those types of issues. But when it comes to a dog resource guarding a human, the human that the dog is resource guarding corrects the dog. That is the best way, and the fastest way rather, to stop a dog from resource guarding a human. So if I had Ari sitting next to me and somebody walked up and she barked and snapped at them, I would say no. I would give her a correction on the training collar. The moment she stopped, I would say good dog. The reason why I'm going to correct that right away, I'm not even going to do the leash pressure. I'm just going to correct it. I want it out of the dog's repertoire. I don't want them practicing something again that could be potentially dangerous either for themselves or for somebody else. And usually when you correct a dog for resource guarding you as the human, they go, oh, I'm sorry, I did not know you didn't want me to do that. I'll stop. So again, this is a situation where I would use positive punishment. And the way I would do it, just like I talked about earlier, we don't want to make it personal. The correction, we're never angry, we're not upset, it's simple cause and effect. So I'm sitting there, I have the leash, I know my dog's gonna react this way because my dog has done it before. So I'm setting my dog up to fail so I can correct my dog the exact moment he or she makes the wrong choice. So I'm sitting there, this is how I would do it. She goes to bark or act aggressive, resource guarding me, and I would go, no, correction. She stops. Yay, good girl. She goes to bark again. No, correction. She stops. Good. She goes to bark. No, correction. She stops. Good. And then I pet and reward her. So again, that's going to be the process that I would take in this situation, because more likely than not, the dog thinks that that's her responsibility, and by simply telling her no and giving her a correction should stop it and should make it go away. How do I stop my dog from getting into other dogs' fights? She can be completely minding her own business, but if other dogs start fighting, she'll get in and fight too. Then again, this is a situation where I'm going to set the dog up to fail. If I know the dog practices this behavior, then either I'm going to make sure I have my dog on a leash. If something does happen, I'm able to stop her before she is able to practice this behavior. Or if it was my dog, I would do remote collar training. I would make sure I have that off-leash, reliably trained dog with the remote collar. And then anytime my dog's in an environment where there's other dogs and there's a possibility of a dog fight breaking out, if the dog fight does break out, I can guarantee to get my dog over to me, prevent my dog from jumping into the dog fight and causing any harm to herself or the other dogs. So again, remote collar training is going to be your friend in a situation like this, where your dog does things when she's off leash and makes it difficult for you to control. The off leash reliability comes with that remote collar training. I'm going to explain very quickly how I teach a dog a remote collar. There are different ways of doing this. This is just the process that I like to do. It works the best, and I've always had success with it, and I'm able to get a dog to be obedience trained on a remote collar, usually pretty fast. There's two brands that I use if I'm using a remote training collar. That's eCollar Technology and Dogtra. I like both of them. They're both great. So if you're going to use one, pick one that you prefer. Now, if I'm using the collar, first I have to get the dog to be what's known as directional to the collar. If you're using a remote collar for behavioral issues that are not based on fear, you don't have to worry about the dog being directional to the collar. When I say directional, I mean the dog understands that it's a correction coming from you as the human. If you read a manual, it's going to say, make sure your dog doesn't know that the collar or the correction's coming from you. What that means is don't take the remote and go, I got the remote, don't make me correct you, dog. That's what it's talking about. But if you're using it for obedience, they have to know it's coming from you. They cannot think it's some magical thing biting them or pinching them or something like that where they don't understand where it's coming from. It's not a bug biting them on the neck. They have to know it's correction coming from you. But again, if it's something that is a behavioral issue, then I'm not worried about them knowing where it comes from. I want them to associate the correction with whatever they were doing. Let me give you an example. I have a dog that digs all the time. So I put the remote training collar on the dog. I send the dog out into the yard. I watch the dog from inside the house, and I wait till that dog starts to dig. The moment that dog starts to dig, I stimulate the collar, and then I get to be the good guy. So the dog gets corrected, and the dog comes running over to me, and I go, "What happened? Did that dirt bite you? That dirt could be mean sometimes. You better not dig." And then the dog associates the correction with digging, stops digging. Easy. But when it comes to obedience, it's a little different. If I have a dog in a downstay, let's say, and I have the remote collar on the dog and I tell the dog to come to me, and the dog decides not to come to me and I just correct the dog can't associate anything to that correction because the dog was just laying there. When they're digging, they can go, "Oh, digging." But if the dog is just laying and gets a correction, the dog can't associate it with anything. So we have to teach them to be directional. I follow the same process that I talked about earlier when it comes to adding corrections within my dog's obedience. I have to make sure they know what's expected, they know how to turn off pressure by complying, and they've been given a very clear path to success. When it comes to correcting them, I pair it with the leash. So I have a flat collar on, and when I go to pop the leash, I'm making sure I pop it at a very light level. I don't want to pop too hard because the correction from the leash pop might override the stimulation from the remote training collar. We want the dog to feel the stimulation from the remote training collar. So I tell the dog, let's say sit. The dog decides not to sit. I say no. I lightly pop the leash upward. The moment I pop the leash, I press the button on the collar, giving the dog a correction or a stimulation from the remote training collar. I pair every correction with the leash for the first 2 weeks. So the dog breaks the stay. I say no. I pop the leash. The moment I pop the leash, I stimulate the collar. I recommand the climb, whatever it is that the dog broke, or the down, and I place the dog back into that position. So I follow the same process that I would if I was just using a normal training collar, like maybe a prong collar, and I'm popping the leash. I usually do this for about 2 weeks. After 2 weeks, I take the leash off, I put the dog on a climb stay, and I wait till the dog breaks the climb stay. When the dog breaks the climb stay, I say one no, I stimulate the collar, and I watch to see what they do. If the dog goes back on the climb platform or the dog freezes, then I know the dog is more likely than not directional to the collar, and I can start implementing it in my obedience. I'll also use it when I'm taking the dog on a walk. They go ahead of me. I'll say no. I'll stimulate the collar without popping the leash, and I'll see how the dog responds. If the dog comes back into heel position and it seems like they knew what they were corrected for and they knew how to adjust accordingly, then that shows me the dog is directional to the remote training collar. Now we can start using the remote training collar on the dog while they're off leash and getting that full 100% reliably trained dog off leash. So this is the Q&A video for today. I hope I've answered a lot of questions, given you guys a little bit more of a clear path. Look forward to the next one. Again, if your question wasn't answered in this video, it should be in one of the following videos because there were, I think, 80 questions asked total. So these will be broken up into multiple videos. Let me know what you think about it in the comments below. Of course, as always, please like, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and I will see you guys in the next one.